Genetic cloning. Cloning is the process of producing genetically identical individuals of an organism, either naturally or artificially. An example of cloning would be the asexual reproduction of bacteria. It starts off as a whole, and then splits itself into an exact genetic copy of itself. But what if cloning didn't stop there? What if cloning could reach into the realm of multicellular organisms? But not just any multicellular organism. What if we could clone humans? But before we find out if we could, we have to first determine whether or not we should. There are pros when it comes to genetic cloning, which include infertile people or same-sex couples could have a child due to the cloning. Cloning could provide a source for transplant organs or tissue. Cloning could provide assistance in genetic research. Cloning would allow us to genetically engineer people for specific traits. Cloning could help us advance and enhance human development. But for anything that has pros, there are cons. Cons like the violation of individuality of the clone. Loss of respect for human life because it would be seen as replaceable and each life would be less unique and meaningful. The psychological stress that comes with knowing you're a clone. Who has domain over the clone and its life, based on why it was created. And the fact that the biological age of the clone would be greater than that of the chronological age of the clone, due to them being cloned from older cells, which would mean its life expectancy would be lower, thus stripping the clone of the right to a normal life expectancy. These are some of the reasons why human cloning is such a controversial topic. Here's Ian Wilmot, co-author of After Dolly, The Uses and Misuses of Human Cloning, also professor of reproductive science, to speak on human cloning.
I think there are a lot of things coming. Using this technology to try to understand human disease, to develop new treatments for them. Maybe, remembering this is a book which is looking a long way into the future, being able to use it to stop the birth of children with inherited disease. I think there are a lot of things which I would encourage people to think about and to be optimistic about this technology and what it can offer. The application that I've never supported is the idea of producing somebody who's a genetically identical twin of a person who's here. But I think, to me, it would be acceptable to produce embryos from which you could get cells, and to produce a baby in which you'd corrected a genetic disease, but it would not be a clone of somebody who was here already. It would be, if you like, a clone of an embryo, and it's being done for a different purpose. So it's very important all the time to say exactly what you have in mind. There's a great variety of different opinions. The United Kingdom, where I work, has some of the most liberal approaches to this, but it is very tightly regulated, which I think is entirely appropriate. But there are many countries in which research with embryos of any kind is limited, and nuclear transfer itself would be prohibited. And so I'd be quite content to see each country preparing its own regulations, and it is of course very disappointing that this country hasn't done so. It is quite possible for societies, it is of course possible for societies to come to different conclusions. But I think a perception that we should have is that there are disadvantages to most technologies. We're using electronic equipment to make this broadcast, which comes from essentially the same physics that blew up two Japanese cities 60 years ago. What's key all the time is for societies to discuss things, to be informed about things, which clearly you make a great contribution to, and then to prepare regulations. There's a great ignorance about this, and this was one of the reasons for writing the book, to explain exactly what is involved, the stage of development of embryo from which we take the cells, and to try to lift people's eyes to a greater horizon as to what can be achieved by research in this area. Must accept that there are different points of view. In terms of working with embryos, I would wish to be sure that they understood exactly the stage of development that we would be working with. So the embryo is smaller than a grain of sand. The micromanipulations we carry out are with very sophisticated equipment, very skilled colleagues, of course, and that it's weeks before the time when there would be the beginnings of a nervous system. Now, to me personally, the key human characteristic is being conscious, aware, being able to form intellectual relationships with people, something which, of course, will happen much, much later in the life of a developing person. But until the point when that begins to occur, which is sometime after the stage we would take cells, I think this is a potential person, but not yet a person. And that's the reason why, to me, it's an acceptable thing to do. I think one project, which a couple of groups certainly are still pursuing intensively, is the idea of changing pigs so that their organs can be used in people. And there is at least a handful of papers now showing that by making a particular genetic change, the organs are able to cope with blood from primates, not from human beings, but much better than anything in the past. I think it's still some way away. There are a lot of challenges still to overcome, but it is something that people are still considering. But I think that it would be really good to be able to increase the efficiency, to understand why the nuclear reprogram doesn't work more accurately, and that would then facilitate everything that we do. But I think a fairly near thing is to be able to produce cells which have the characteristics of a patient with ALS, for example, which was a disease mentioned earlier in your program, which is a relentlessly progressive disease, which means that people lose control of their limbs and ultimately die because they stop breathing. A very sad situation. It isn't understood. Now, one problem is that the nerves which are affected are deep inside the body, so that researchers can't get access to them to study them. If we produce cells from cloned embryos from a person who had inherited the disease, it would be possible for the first time to study those cells as they began to change for the very first time, to understand it, and hopefully to develop a high-throughput drug screening system which would enable us to assess thousands of drugs and hopefully identify something which could stabilize the position of patients. I think that it would be 5, 10, 15 years before that program would be completed, probably 10 years before it would be completed. But I think there is a realistic hope that would bring forward the first drug to be able to stabilize the position of patients. And we haven't got time before the end of your program to list the number of diseases which could be studied in that way. I mean, they vary from some causes of sudden death because of heart failure, cancer, psychiatric disease, other neurodegenerative disease. There's a huge range of inherited diseases that we don't understand and for which there isn't a treatment. Well, the other thing that we would like to do is to understand cloning, because there's another thing which I believe ultimately will be the greatest inheritance of the Dolly experiment, which is by understanding cloning, I think we may be able to change cells of one type, somebody mentioned cord blood cells earlier on, into another type without making an embryo. And that would facilitate the idea of patient-specific cells. And I think it's in that sort of way that by making biologists think differently, the Dolly experiment has been most important of all.
And with the information provided, I pose a question. Human cloning, along with any other scientific advancement, breakthrough, or experimentation, poses its negative effects, but it also has its advantages. And it's our responsibility as a society to determine whether or not the pros outweigh the cons. So here's my question. Do you believe that human cloning research should continue? My name is Blake Lewis, and thank you for watching my documentary on human cloning. Goodbye.